Your DNA is probably already in a database. You didn't have to provide a sample or give consent, but the unique sequence of A's, T's, G's, and C's that make you you are searchable nonetheless.
And that's a huge problem. And before we get into the main thrust of this video, if you like this and you want to see more like it, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. It really helps the show out. In Veritasium's latest video, Derek told the story of the Golden State Killer, one of the nation's most prolific serial killers, who was brought to justice in 2018 due to DNA evidence. It was a novel use though, where the Golden State Killer's DNA specimen was matched against the genetic genealogy database GEDmatch. They were able to build a family tree of the killer's distant relatives. Using clues like approximate age, sex, and place of residence, they narrowed down the list of suspects from over 1,000 family members to a list of 5 potential matches. And then they surreptitiously collected DNA samples from the primary suspect to match against the killer's DNA profile. In the end, a former police officer, Joseph James D'Angelo Jr., was positively identified and brought to justice. This was not only a win for the victims of D'Angelo's crime spree, it was also a victory for law enforcement, since subsequently there have been some 70 cases that have been solved in the same way. But I think that there's a darker side to this story, one where Veritasium touched on in the video, but didn't really expand upon. He and some of the people he interviewed in this video mentioned that there is room for abuse here, but they all seemed to brush off the idea of privacy invasion because of the benefits that this technology gives to law enforcement. But I think that a tool that allows us to solve decades-old cold cases has ample room for very real abuse in the actual world that we live in. One of the few negatives of this technology that it did touch upon in Veritasium's video was the very real possibility that insurance companies could get a hold of genetic testing information and then either deny you coverage or raise your rates to astronomically high, unaffordable prices. That's obviously a horrific possibility, but it's one that is very real in the United States, where we have regulation that is effectively scant to none, and insurance companies are able to run whatever racket they want. Imagine being denied medical care because of the results of a genetic test, or maybe even being denied employment or fired from your job because keeping you on the payroll would raise everyone else's insurance premium. Now, there are laws in place like the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, but it's limited in scope and leaves the door open for discrimination from employers and medical insurance companies. It simply doesn't go far enough. Now, while some employers and insurance companies might be prohibited from, flat out discrimination against you based on your genetic testing profile, there are other ways that you can be discriminated against. Many cultures throughout human history have implemented a caste system, often based off of family lineage, skin tone, occupation, tribe, or wealth. Imagine one based on genetics. Largely invisible factors you have no control over, but that absolutely define the bounds and limitations of who you can become. If we're not exceptionally careful, we could be walking into exactly that kind of social stratification, where the results of a genetic test can determine what jobs you're allowed to have, what schools you're allowed to attend, what public offices you're allowed to hold, and where you're allowed to live. But what about HIPAA, I hear you ask? HIPAA is a law that was written at the dawning of the internet. HIPAA was written before Google was a corporation. People were still skeptical of supplying their credit card information to a website, let alone the idea of ordering a genetic test from a website and then sending it off to be integrated into some database. So it might come as no surprise that 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and most of the other genetic testing services are not bound by HIPAA and may disclose at their discretion any of your information to anyone they so choose, and they can be subpoenaed for that information too. They're a self-regulated industry governed solely by their own terms of service. But as we know, a terms of service is really only meant to protect the service provider from the end user. In 2019, GEDmatch violated their terms of service to help solve a crime that was outside the established scope of law enforcement involvement. The crime was a 17-year-old entering a Mormon church in Centerville, Utah, and putting a 71-year-old woman in a chokehold. She passed out and he left her for dead. She survived, and the cops were able to recover a DNA specimen of the assailant. GEDmatch unambiguously stated that they only assist law enforcement if a crime involves a homicide or a sexual assault. This crime involved neither. Law enforcement approached Gedmatch's owner, Curtis Rogers, and asked for special permission to use his database to solve this one crime, because they were worried the attacker would strike again. Rogers gave them special permission, and they were able to find the assailant and bring him to justice. And you might be tempted to think, well, who cares? I mean, don't we want perfect justice? But perfect justice assumes the laws are fair, that the punishments are equitable, and that trials are always impartial. And we know that they're not. And the reality is that our world today is standing on the precipice of authoritarianism. Eastern Europe, the Middle East, South America, Asia, some of our allies, and even here at home. We can't afford to be handing over what little privacy we have left. If it's the phone in your pocket that's constantly spying on you, or you willingly giving over your genetic information to a database that can be used to single out your family. Maybe one of your relatives committed a crime. Maybe they're just political dissidents. Maybe they have a low credit score. Whatever the reasoning for their pariahship, it might start to leak across the branches of their family tree. This isn't some paranoid fantasy. China is currently assembling the world's largest DNA database and actively using it to quell dissent. There's no distinction between policing crime and attacking basic human rights in China, and they are forcibly acquiring samples of every male in their country in violation of their fundamental human right to privacy. That's why it's both fascinating and incredibly frightening to me that America returned to life as normal after January 6th, as if nothing happened. As if there wasn't almost a Grand Chancellor of America seated by an angry mob, if they had been slightly more violent, if the rioters had made it into the Capitol building a few minutes earlier and taken congressional leaders or Mike Pence hostage, there wouldn't have been a certification of the election that day. Democracy could have fallen, and there's no guarantee that it can't happen again, more violent and more destructive. And if the fascists win, they'll come for you and they'll come for your family. They will nationalize Google and Apple and Verizon and Comcast to listen in on everything you do. They will call out privately held genetic databases in order to ensure ubiquitous generational loyalty to the glorious leader. What happens when the laws change? What happens when it becomes illegal to be a dissenter, or to be related to a dissenter, or to resist injustice and help a minority, or even it becomes illegal to be a minority? No matter where you stand politically, there is a threat of authoritarianism that is looming heavy over planet Earth. Genetic databases are just one more tool that can be used to single out individuals, families, or just people of a certain race, and that shouldn't be celebrated. These companies that hold this data should be heavily regulated by independent oversight if they're allowed to exist at all. And governments should not be allowed to hold or use this information without probable cause and the issue of legitimate warrants.
If you ask Americans, should we have a national database where everyone's logged in it?
As their DNA.
Yeah, by their DNA and their name. Most Americans will be somewhat uncomfortable or potentially very uncomfortable with that. But we're kind of sleepwalking into that scenario. Once your genetic information's out there, it's out there. It's not like a credit card where you can get a new one. Yeah, you're giving away something that you don't know what it can do.
Look, I'm actually a fan of Veritasium. I really enjoy his videos. Science and technology are some of my favorite fields of study, and I love the exploration of new ideas. But his video missed the mark in one critical way, and that is that it came off feeling like a propaganda piece for these genetic database holders, rather than a proper educational documentary about this topic. I don't know. I would love to know what you make of all this. Please let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. But that's going to do it for now. Thank you very much for watching. I want to thank all of my amazing patrons over on Patreon and everyone who supports the channel on YouTube as a YouTube member. It's because of you guys that I'm able to do these type of videos, and I just wanted to say thanks. If you believe in the work that I'm doing and you want to help the show out, you can become a patron or a YouTube member by using the links in the description. That's going to do it for this video, though. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you all have a blessed day, and I'll see you in the next one.